This video will contain spoilers for the game How We Know We're Alive. If you care about spoilers, I recommend playing the game for yourself and then coming back to this video. Thank you. As human beings, we all rely on assumptions. Neither you nor I are capable of being experts on everything around us, so we have to make assumptions about the nature of reality. For example, it's safe to assume that the floor beneath me is structurally sound and won't give way. Similarly, I assume that the teachers at my university know what they're talking about and are teaching me useful information that will help me succeed in my future career. We cannot be experts on everything in our lives, so we sometimes have to trust that reality is what others say it is. However, making assumptions is a tricky business. It is very easy to assume too much about our lives and the lives of others. Today, I want to talk about a game that I found called How We Know We're Alive. Although the game's beauty drew me in, I was pleasantly surprised that it was the story, characters, and themes that kept me captivated. In How We Know We're Alive, the player is invited to explore the dangers of making assumptions, particularly in the face of tragedy. Through the story of Sarah and Maria, the game challenges players to question their own assumptions about justice and morality, and to recognize the limits of our control over the world. Despite being only an hour long, the game leaves a lasting impact on the player, inviting us to reflect on our own biases and the way in which they shape our perceptions of the world around us. To better understand how the game achieves this, I need to explain a little something called the just world fallacy. Have you ever seen a news story covering something bad that happened to someone and thought that it was preventable on the injured person's behalf? For example, you might see a story saying that a robber broke into someone's house when their doors weren't locked and think, in hindsight, well, that's stupid. I myself definitely would have locked the doors and prevented the robber from stealing my stuff. If you've ever thought in any way like that, consciously or subconsciously, you have just victim blamed and fallen victim to the just world fallacy. But don't worry, I'm not accusing you of blasphemy or anything like that if you've had thoughts like this before. This is a common cognitive bias that nearly everyone has fallen victim to. According to Sherry Hamby, a professor of psychology at the University of the South, the just world fallacy is the, quote, idea that people deserve what happens to them. There's just a really strong need to believe that we all deserve our outcomes and consequences, end quote. She further explains that, quote, in my experience, people blame victims so that they can continue to feel safe, end quote. In my earlier example, many people would blame that person for not locking their doors and assure themselves that they would lock their doors, thus not getting robbed. You make yourself feel safe this way, assuming that because you lock your doors and they didn't, you justify to yourself why they got robbed and why you wouldn't. However, it isn't necessarily the fault of the victim that they got robbed. They just happened to make the robber's life a little bit easier by not locking their doors. The tendency to blame the victim for not locking their doors is a manifestation of the just world fallacy. When we blame the victim, we are trying to justify to ourselves why bad things happen to others, and why we believe we are safe from those same things happening to us. However, the just world fallacy is a dangerous assumption to make. It encourages us to ignore the systemic and structural factors that can contribute to unfortunate events such as poverty, inequality, crime, and simple random chance. In my example, the person may have not been able to afford a better lock, or they may have simply forgotten to lock their door in a moment of distraction. Additionally, the perpetrator may have been motivated by a multitude of factors, such as desperation or addiction, rather than the victim's vulnerability. By acknowledging the limitations of the just world fallacy, we can begin to look at events and situations through a more nuanced lens. We can recognize that we are not immune to the whims of fate, and that sometimes, even the most careful and conscientious among us may experience hardship. Now, you might be asking yourself, how does this apply to the game How We Know We're Alive? Well, let's begin with some background about the game itself. The game begins with you playing as a girl named Sarah, who has returned to her hometown of Herrljunga, Sweden to visit her friend Maria. The two have grown distant, and Sarah has come back from Stockholm, Sweden to reconnect. When she arrives, the town has a melancholy atmosphere that's enhanced by the drab music and steady rain. You can inspect the area around you and recall memories of Hurunga and past experiences you've had there. As Sarah goes deeper into the town, she eventually finds herself in the cemetery, where the player learns that she's actually there to visit Maria's grave 1 year after passing. Sarah talks to Maria, saying hello to the grave for the first time because she couldn't face coming to the funeral a year prior. As she speaks to the grave, she makes a striking claim, quote, "You should have come with me. You wouldn't be here if you just... ... unquote." In this scene, we first witness Sarah succumb to the just world fallacy. She assumes that if Maria had followed her plan, everything would have turned out alright, and that Maria would still be alive today. This scene is particularly striking because the player doesn't yet know how Maria has died, but Sarah blames Maria for not following her plan, rather than considering other factors that may have contributed to her death. It's a moment that highlights Sarah's self-centeredness and her inability to see past her own assumptions. Soon after the scene, there's a flashback that informs the player that Sarah and Maria have a long and well thought out plan to move to and work in Stockholm together. It is revealed that Maria was pregnant and planned to keep the baby, implying that she was going to stay in Hurunga. Sarah assumes and asserts that Maria is only keeping the baby because of her parents' religious beliefs. This ultimately results in the two friends taking different paths in life. Returning to the present, Sarah talks to people around town and gathers more details about her friend's death. After investigating and going to her friend's old room, Sarah finds a receipt for alcohol purchased on the night Maria died. Sarah knows that Maria died in a car accident far away from home, and begins to formulate a narrative that Maria must have been drunk driving due to her difficult life in Hurunga. Sarah assumes that Maria was depressed because she never got to fulfill her true ambition of living with Sarah in Stockholm. Sarah then goes to present her theory to Maria's sister, Lena. However, Lena berates her for making such a claim. Lena didn't want to do this because of its hurtful nature, but she reveals that the main reason Maria had bought alcohol and was far from home during the crash was that she was actually on her way to visit Sarah to celebrate the publication of a new book. Sarah realizes her mistake and runs off. The last we see of her is sitting atop a car overlooking Hurunga, the place where she and Maria used to spend time together. How We Know We're Alive is a story about the assumptions we make, as well as the biases that influence us to make those assumptions. Sarah starts off as a self-centered person who's only interested in her own feelings and regrets. She investigates Maria's death as a coping mechanism to prove that she wasn't wrong in the first place and to somehow justify her frustration with Maria for not coming with her to Stockholm. Sarah had wholly fallen into the trap of the just world fallacy. She believed that if everything had gone according to her plan, and if Maria had listened to her, everything would have turned out alright, and Maria would still be here today. But because Maria didn't follow her plan, Sarah believes that Maria's sadness and early death was a direct result of her own decisions. However, when Sarah unearths the truth about Maria's death, it shatters her egocentric view of reality. She was forced to confront the possibility that Maria had her own life that she enjoyed, that she had loving and caring people around her, that she found her own success and fulfillment, and, worst of all, that she did it all without Sarah. At this moment, she's challenged by the fact that Maria's death was nothing more than a tragic accident that happened to an undeserving person. In the final scene of How We Know We're Alive, we see Sarah staring off into the distance, silently rethinking the mistakes she had made. This is the game developers inviting the players to reflect on their own assumptions and how we sometimes make the assumption that others are solely responsible for the adversities they face. The game aims to help players recognize that we're mistaken when we believe we have control over the world, and that if we do everything right, then everything will work out. We often think that our actions deserve a certain outcome, but life is not always that predictable. Furthermore, the conclusion of the game is a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of the universe. It reminds us that even the most honest and virtuous people can be taken from us at any moment, and that sometimes good deeds go unrewarded, while bad things happen to good people. This realization challenges us to question our own assumptions about justice and morality, and to recognize the limits of our control over the world. The story of Sarah and Maria invites us to reflect on our own biases and the ways in which they shape our perceptions of the world around us, and to approach life with a greater sense of humility and empathy.